it feels like the gaming YouTube community is perfectly willing to look at a tweet that says that Nintendo Switch 2 had a bad holiday season from this unreliable source on Twitter. They're going to take this person completely seriously and then try and gaslight everyone into thinking that it's real and that the Switch 2 is failing, even though that all the signs we have been seeing is that the Switch 2 has been doing very well. You know, you're seeing people do this thing like, well, when you compare it to the Switch 1's first year, like, yeah, the Switch 1 had a full, like, 3 months more than the Switch 2. Okay, that launched in March. The Switch 2 launched in June. Okay, like, the Switch 2 is basically only just now reaching its halfway point for its first full year. And that's definitely one of the things I feel when looking at like the numbers and like the misrepresentation and like the coping and seething. You know, people are doing this thing like, oh, there were no Mario or Zelda games yet, and that's why it's failing. And I'm just like, bro, when the Mario and Zelda games come out, the Switch 2 is gonna explode in popularity and relevancy. You know, like you're seeing so many people like bend over backwards complaining about like silly things like the Mario Kart World intermissions and like the Donkey Kong Bonanza and like the Metroid Prime 4 and stuff like that. And like all of it just doesn't really add up, you know, especially when you take into consideration that the Switch 1 is still on store shelves. You know, the Switch 2 isn't really a next generation console in the traditional sense. It's basically just an upgraded Switch 1. You know, it's kind of a Game Boy Color generation extender, you know, kind of deal. Like, it has a handful of exclusive games, but there's not really gonna be like this period where Nintendo is producing like a bunch of games that are only going to be on Switch 2. Like, what's going to happen going forward is that you are going to see a lot of games that are releasing on both Switch 1 and Switch 2, and that you're going to see people buy these games for both consoles for all sorts of reasons, right? You know, you can upgrade Switch 1 games to Switch 2 games with a digital purchase, so like, there's not any real reason to kind of rush out and buy a Switch 2 right now. And I think that's what a lot of people don't realize, is that Nintendo has essentially successfully managed to create a multi-generational platform in which the Switch 1 and Switch 2 are going to coexist. You know, there are still going to be plenty of Switch 1 games for the next couple of years. You know, Switch 2 is mostly kind of defined by it's third-party games, honestly, because we're getting a lot of games that, like, you know, the industry tried to tell us couldn't possibly run on a Switch 1, right? You know, World of Assassination, Street Fighter 6, Cyberpunk 2077, you know, like, just to name a few. Like, I'm not exaggerating when I say, like, I think most of the best games that came out on the Switch 2 year one are games that were, multi-gen, games that launched both on Switch 1 and Switch 2, or were multi-plat in general. Like, the way it looks to me right now is that the Switch 2 is just something that is going to extend the lifespan of the original Switch, that is going to keep these games relevant, that is just the beginnings of your games being tied to a Nintendo account and not necessarily a Nintendo console. So what that means is that Nintendo's going to release new hardware, and you'll just be able to, like, you know, put your account on it and, like, okay, download all the games you've bought over the years. You know, like, this is something that I think a lot of people don't understand the implications of, because this is going to be the end of, like, you know, the decades-old narrative that, like, Steam was somehow better than consoles because, like, well, Steam, with PC, you get to keep all your games over the years. Like, yeah, you can do that with Nintendo consoles. Like, you know, you're never going to get rid. Traditionally, you didn't have to get rid of your old Nintendo hardware, but for this situation, for this matter, what it seems like is that Nintendo has pretty much closed out all of, like, you know, the traditional copes when it comes to like why people don't buy Nintendo hardware. People complaining about the prices. The prices are lower than the competition in spite of all the coping and seething. You have like the multi-gen stuff. You have like the digital purchases. You have like the accounts. You have like the backlog of old software. You have games going on sale pretty regularly at this point. Like all the you have like M-rated games, like no censorship, the entire like giant cope that the industry have invented out of whole cloth over the years to try and downplay Nintendo consoles. It's completely collapsing, honestly. And I really do think this is going to be kind of the last stand of like the Nintendo hate community. Like even now, you have people freaking out over the realization that like people are opting to go for like a Nintendo Switch 2 with the GameCube NSO rather than get into using Dolphin. Like NSO is objectively better than Dolphin at this point. And a lot of people are like really seething and angry about that. Because, the narrative has always been that, like, emulators will always be superior to official releases. But in actuality, emulators are illegal. And they do take a lot of time and money to learn how to set up. And it's simply not worth it. Like, when you can pay $50 for, like, a yearly subscription to play old Nintendo games, why would you not do that, Like, all of the coping people have, like, about NSO. Like, oh, the selection. Oh, like, I want to own my games. Like, not true. Especially when there are plenty of opportunities to like buy a lot of these games on the eShop. There are plenty of like alternative ways to play these games on Nintendo consoles that kind of suit a wide range of interests, but like there simply isn't really a demand for it. Like that's the reality that we're seeing. And like the thing I want to like kind of emphasize going forward is that like no matter what Nintendo did, no matter what the console was, no matter how many games they put out, no matter like how great the first year was, like a certain demographic of people online were always going to whine and complain. That's the simple reality that we really do have to accept is that Nintendo haters, pretendos and like the grifters and like all these like different sub communities of people, like these guys revolve their entire lives around hating Nintendo and downplaying the company. These are the guys who will try and tell you that the Nintendo Wii failed that console generation and that Nintendo was thrown into irrelevancy because of its failure, but in actuality, the Wii won that console generation. That was the beginning of the end of the PlayStation and Xbox hegemony. And the industry has never really recovered since then, in spite of all their efforts to keep the grift going. Like, what we've seen over the past several years is just this insane, delusional, denial that Nintendo has won the console war. And there's this endless feeling that mobile will save us, PC will save us. I keep seeing people do this thing where they're like, oh, PC is the only market that's growing, which is obviously retarded. Again, it does feel like at this point, when it comes to these sales comparisons and PC versus console, it's like an apples to oranges thing. Okay, who's actually making money on PC? Is it game devs? Is it publishers? Is it Steam? No. The reality is Nintendo is branching out into an IP-focused company. They're branching out into producing their hardware outside of gaming hardware. They're beginning to do more and more things while companies like Steam completely and totally fail. That's the trend we've been seeing in recent years. The thing that really irritates me from a fundamental level is just seeing just how many people just bend over backwards to keep up this facade that Steam is better than Nintendo when all the games on Steam are also available on Switch too. It's remarkable. How desperate the community is to keep up the facade. And it does need to get called out for what it is. And right now, we're still in that phase where randos on Twitter are trying to tell you that the Switch 2 has been a failure and that it's falling off in sales and that nobody likes it. Don't believe it, honestly. at this stage, the Switch 2 is shaping up to be one of my favorite pieces of hardware ever, and I can't imagine that's going to change anytime soon.